Keith, welcome. Before we get started, for those, how many of you are familiar with Wolverine? You're about to.
Nice.
Let's run a reel to give us a sense both of Wolverine as a brand, but also its voice in advertising.
Spirit dust, vibrating masks, gold dumbbells. Now that is how a self-care industry is built. These trends had to pull some yawny stones out of their, to keep telling us you need more this to be more that. So, let's say we put our foot down. 20 years ago, Merrill paved the way with our first women's hiking shoe. And today, we're building on that legacy, empowering all of us to take it outside. What if we got some real oxygen therapy and went straight to the source of all things green and raw? What if it's there that we discovered that you and her and us were more than enough, and that all we ever really needed more of was less?
Tell us about what do we have another one?
Yeah.
Okay, let's run.
There we go.
Okay. Give us the general overview of what Wolverine is, because it really encompasses a lot of brands.
So Wolverine is a collection of footwear brands as well as apparel. We have a number of different brands like Merrill, Sperry, Saucony, but are not limited to just those. Our job.
Hush Puppies.
Hush Puppies.
Stride
yes.
Right, from my generation,
Right.
the ones that I recognize.
For any of you guys who watched Dirty Dancing, Keds is definitely one of them as well. And then we recently had an acquisition of Sweaty Betty. So that also was basically adding to the portfolio.
Yeah. I have an embarrassing story about when I first started talking to Keith's colleague, Ben, about Wolverine. I didn't know much about the brands, and he kept mentioning Merrill as one of their lead brands, and I had to ask him what Merrill was. And my female colleague on the call, I could almost hear her face plant when I asked that question. And when I got off the call, I went to my wife and I said, I think I embarrassed myself on the call. I didn't know are you familiar with the Merrill brand? And she looked at me as if I was, in fact, the idiot she knew she married, and said, look in my closet, half my shoes are Merrill. So apologies there. But tell us then about the media footprint for all of those brands, because you're managing a lot of different brands, I think with a lot of different targets.
Correct.
So tell us a little bit about where you're buying media and where the money goes.
So we run the entire gamut, right, of digital marketing. So we look at CTV, OTT, we look at display, search, social programmatic affiliates, look at online video as a vehicle that we will focus on to actually drive digital performance both in the short term as well as the long term. And I think that's a really important point that I want to try to continue to stress through this time period.
So you have, as advertised, you have been across pretty much the entire supply chain when it comes to contemporary digital advertising. And I know that you've noted across the way, and we wanted to talk more globally about some of the common weaknesses you've seen in the system, that you've seen common among all of those, and that has a lot to do with demand planning.
Correct.
As I would say, go, fish where the fishes are.
Right.
But you have a very different take on it.
Yeah, I
wanted
do.
to surface.
Slightly different. I don't think of it as fish where the fish are. I think about fish when the fish are. Right? So we look at conversion analysis and try to understand when people are actually purchasing. There is a normal sort of cadence around when somebody may actually purchase within our audience segment, right? So when you think about, weekdays versus weekends, right? You think about certain days of the week that actually has a higher performance sort of associated with it, you want to put more dollars behind it, right? You want to put, for lack of a better term, more bait out there, right? To actually spend more to drive more revenue, right? And a lot of times what ends up happening with a lot of these programmatic or biddable sort of technologies is you put a ceiling in terms of your budgets. You want to change that. You want to start thinking about how do you push more dollars into market when people are shopping. Now, on the flip side of it, right, I'm sure most of you guys are thinking about it from an AI perspective. Things like TROAS within Google or CBO within Facebook, right? These are machine learning entities that require additional data. So every time you make a change, I believe it's 5 to 10% of a change, whether it be budgets, bidding, whatever it may be, it has to relearn. And so making sure that you're actually putting time behind that in advance of that time period is critical. So thinking and planning and organizing beforehand is probably imperative, because what you will see a lot of times is fluctuations. So you might get some of the revenue, but the machine learning is actually trying to be aggressive. It's trying to push the upper bounds to see what your ceiling looks like at a particular ROAS value.
But these tools also have allowed companies to fall into the easy path of chasing immediate revenue.
Yeah,
as
absolutely.
opposed to longer-term lead generation. So you have a lot of legacy brands, and you have a lot of brand maintenance and brand building to do. So tell us a little bit about your view of how you balance that that sort of bright shiny object, which is immediate revenue that you can turn levers to push, and those that longer-term demand generation.
Correct. So you have to be efficient within your lower funnel, right? You have to make sure that you are driving and capturing the revenue that exists. But at some point, you run out of actual headroom. So think of brand terms. You want to keep on spending until there's no more budget left, right? So yesterday, I could spend $10. My objective is to actually increase my available inventory to $12 tomorrow. You can't do it by buying more brand terms or increasing your bids on that. What you have to do is think about upper funnel and really think about how you want to sort of plan your budgets through what I refer to as moment planning, right? And if you can actually show that slide, that graph. It's an ugly slide, apologies. I am an analytics guy, I'm not an aesthetic guy, all right? So first and foremost, what really talks about is the different layers of revenue that can be generated. When you think of the green line, you're really talking about the BAU or the organic traffic that you would have gotten either way, right? On the flip side of that, right, the next grouping is around the defensive, right? So if you have competition, things of that nature, you're trying to sort of squeeze those dollars out. This is where the sort of age-old question of, do you buy brand terms within Google, right? That's where you're actually picking that revenue up. And then finally is the revenue that you generate because you're spending, right? And you're pushing that up. But at some point, you run out. So, I'm sure you've heard this from clients. If you are a brand side, probably hearing from finance or executive leadership, we need more revenue. Right? How do you do that? You can't do it in the short term. You can't compress demand inside of that time period, which means you got to get the word out. You have to understand that you have to influence individuals to come to the site to potentially purchase, which is why I look at it from a time period perspective, upper funnel engagement focus, actual buyers and investment, which allows me to push from 2 to 4. So the idea is how you do this is critical. Now, what's a perfect example of this? Black Friday, Cyber Monday, right? How do you spend for that moment? How do you think about how you spend during, President's Day weekend or Labor Day weekend or back to school? These are all sort of moment marketing sort of opportunities. How do you get the word out as cost effectively as possible? The other thing is a lot of people will actually identify during that sort of time period to push mid-funnel and upper funnel during that weekend of Cyber 5. That's when everything is expensive. You're talking about CPCs that are inflated. You're talking about CPM being inflated. How do you push that out so you can get the engagement beforehand, before somebody has ultimately selected a product, and that you can be part of their consideration set, so ultimately they can make a decision to purchase you over a competitor of yours?
So I hope you're taking notes, because every time I talk to Keith, he does.
Sorry, I talk
this.
fast too.
He loads me up with information I have to go back and process later. I like the idea. Let's talk more practically and out of example, and the way this applies to Wolverine. And especially, I like especially like this idea of fishing when the fish are. I like the time span piece to this. So let's talk about how you actually do that at Wolverine, because you have to anticipate, you need to use tools to anticipate these peaks. Some of them are built into the calendar, but others are not.
Right. So there are certain, like I mentioned, there are certain days of the week, for instance, weekends, where people are going to do more shopping than weekdays. Put dollars behind that during the weekends. Make sure that you're actually spending, your budgets are up going into Friday. Now, the problem is, if you make a change on Friday, you're going back into learning period, and basically you get a lot of fluctuations. What do? You actually start making changes on Tuesday or Wednesday, right? So actually understanding the technology that you're playing with is probably just as important, if not more important, than the actual goals themselves. And anecdotally, the one other thing outside of Wolverine, an example that I wanted to provide was back in the day when I had repped a lot of hotels. We had a lot of Chicago hotels. And in January, I assume anyone who's been to Chicago in January doesn't want to go back in January, right? But they would try and push more and more bookings for January when the demand has already been basically wiped out. What ends up happening is you see competition start to just spike. These bubbles begin to be created, right? So you want that one booking, right, out of 10. CPCs start to rise at an exponential rate, and it becomes ineffective. Instead of planning for, you know what, instead of getting those 5 bookings in January, let's focus on April and May. Let's actually push that out further out so that in 2023, in total, your revenue is still the same amount, but for that one particular time period, or for January, stay away from it. Obviously, you want to pick up the revenue. You can't have unsold rooms, but recognize that there's an efficiency play here that you have to take advantage of or consider.
So I've always thought that one of the weird parts of the programmatic space and the performance marketing space is because there's so many numbers behind it, because you can actually move certain levers and actually see results at the other end, that it gives the false impression that you actually really understand the customer journey, because it feels so more precise than it is. Right. What are some of the blind spots that you have in mapping that customer journey, and what are some of the ways that you address it?
Right. So blind spots exist because of attribution models at the end of the day, right? When we think about, Google Analytics, right? They're a last click environment. That means that you get 100% or 0. It's one or the other. It's a binary environment. And also, it is last click. So whoever clicked last gets the conversion credit, right? Now, what's the value? Why even use GA then in that situation? Well, because you get organic attribution. So you can see the entire universe of conversions, or what is available in that specific case, as we talked about earlier with Freddie and the cookie sort of deprecation and all the sort of other components to that. But you can at least see what is available in terms of total conversions. Now, that's the upside. The downside, as I mentioned, is that last click component, because there are so many touch points before that final click that occurs, whether it be through affiliates, through brand search, or even organic. Right? So what we try to do is look at it from a DDA perspective, looking at only the ecosystem of paid media. Now that gives you at least multi-touch attribution through the lens of cookies. That is GCM, right? GCM uses Google Campaign Manager, uses that, but that's not perfect either. Why? Because you're not getting the full universe anymore. You're only getting paid media, right? Then you look at publishers. They only look at the ecosystem in which they sort of exist, whether it be affiliates for Rakuten or RAN. You look at Facebook's conversion data or Google Ads data, right? Independently of anything else. These are all problems. MMM and MTA solve for a lot of it. Now, as we talked about this over the last 24 hours, the problem with MMM and MTA is the processing of that data, more importantly, how long it takes to get it, right, and get a good read. And so what you start noticing is when you stack each one of these attribution models together, you start seeing these blind spots. 2 main blind spots that I see is upper funnel is undervalued and mid funnel is undervalued, while lower funnel is overvalued, right? When you look at it from an affiliate perspective or brand search, we are way over sort of crediting the last click. On the other side of the equation, mid funnel and upper funnel, all those touches to get somebody to the site and convert them, right? I don't know who actually talked about this, but 38 impressions to get somebody to the site through display, right? My analysis has shown 60 impressions to actually convert them.
All paid.
All paid.
All paid.
60.
That's a lot.
Right.
How does that change your overall view of your media plan when you're recognizing that that it actually takes that much effort? Does it change the way you think about frequency? Does it change where you're placing?
Yeah, absolutely. So you have to look at allocations, right? Using MMM. So you start with the MMM, and you operate off the MTA. Now, MMM and MTA, when I was talking about this a little earlier, is econometric modeling. It basically severs the tie between stimuli and outcomes. And then it looks at what are the correlations between the two, right? So it is using statistical regression to say confidence levels of what is the best outcome you can get based upon the distribution of budgets, right? So in this specific situation, what you're doing is starting with how do you maximize short-term revenue? Now, the one other thing that I want to call out within MMM and MTA, not only is it sort of lagging in terms of latency, but also the problem with MMM and MTA is that it looks at short-term revenue as 0 to 12 months. So how do you predict how much revenue you're going to generate in Q1 when the model actually shows a 12-month window? You have to actually start graphing that out as well, right? You have to extrapolate based upon a parabolic shape where you think the actual revenue is going to hit, assuming that you continue to spend at the same levels. More importantly, you flip it on its head. Everything that I'm talking about is direct response, right? There's direct response sort of logic behind it. So MMM actually quantifies individual campaigns and channels and the ROAS tied to it in the short term, or at least within the next 12 months. So you can allocate dollars to certain brand campaigns that you think of as brand campaigns as actual revenue drivers, right? And so it has a dual focus or a dual purpose with a lot of these campaigns, and how you actually capture that is through MTA, right? So the next step in that is once you actually have the campaign set up, how do you continue to iterate on these programs through MTA data to actually be able to squeeze more and more dollars out in the short term?
How are you creating attribution models that account for this? What are you doing at Wolverine? How are you counting?
We'll use all, right? As I mentioned earlier, you can't use one because they all have gaps, every single one of them, in some way or another. So we use, last click, to directionally identify that things are working, are continuing to directionally work. DDA, we use to actually make sure our agency of record manages to a particular ROAS, right? And then finally, MMM and MTA are used to ultimately say that, you know what, we are on the right path over the quarter and the year.
You mentioned cookies, though, a couple of times. Mm-hmm. How are you anticipating and dealing with cookie deprecation? What's your plan in place when some of these measurement techniques really start becoming less and less reliable?
Maybe reach out to Freddie.
Yeah.
Cookies are deprecating. It is what it is right now. What we need to do is figure out first-party data. I think what everyone is talking about is actually making sure that you are using CRM to sort of identify those users, make sure that you're engaging with those users, and continue to populate your first-party data. That's ultimately the vehicle in which you target them. The technology is still sort of nascent. We don't know what the technology is going to end up being. We talk about live ramp IDs. You talk about all these different sort of technologies in the spines. No one has a solution. I don't care what anyone says. The solution doesn't exist at this point in time. So should I prepare for the inevitability of something to replace cookies, or should I try to actually focus on the CDP, or basically our database, to be in the best position so that when that solution comes to be, that I can actually pivot quickly?
Okay, I want to go back to your point about branding, that you felt that the upper funnel was being undervalued.
Yeah.
So tell me, how are you moving media into the upper funnel? Where are you doing it? How are you doing it? And then how are you really measuring its down funnel effects?
Correct. So we talked about sort of treating some of the brand campaigns as direct response sort of components, right? Using it as a ROAS as a double sort of function. The second thing we do is also look at reach and frequency against our budgets. It's mathematical, right? At the end of the day, we can say how much budget you have available, but we know that you want to hit a user twice a week for a certain time period to ensure that you're getting breakthrough number one, but more importantly is that those individuals that are not in market, when they become in market, have you moved the UBA, or the unaided brand awareness, as well as the brand awareness component to it? These are the measurement components within the brand space that you really want to start tracking, right? And unaided brand awareness actually is correlated to sales by, I think it's 0.96, which is basically, I mean, at that point, if you move UBA, you move sales, right? The only problem is the timing piece. I don't know when somebody's gonna be in market, right? You know, I make a joke about this. We have Saucony as a brand, but my sort of philosophy on running is only when chased, right? But at some point, I become part of the addressable market, right? Because I'm starting to run now. So how did Saucony know that? They didn't. They wouldn't have. And there are a lot of people like that. And so making sure that when I decide that I want to run, that I'm thinking Saucony, right? And that's the emotional connection that you have to actually sort of garner rather than maybe an intellectual one, because you do forget.
How do you define an addressable market for a brand like that? To capture you, whose basic attitude has been up till now, no,
Right.
I'm not running.
It is definitely a tricky, I think each brand has to have its own sort of definition ultimately. It's anyone that would actually purchase the pair of shoes, right? Based upon a specific demographic, based on a specific behavior. Those are the ways I would look at it.
And what's the creative appeal at that level? At that higher level, brand awareness level, what are you trying to get across there?
Those videos. It's about a message. It is about a mission, right? It is about solving for something that we don't recognize exists, right? When you talk about the more or less campaign, and that resonated, right? And so it's more than just selling a product. It's got to be about what we are all about.
Let's talk specific channels, though. Which channels are registering the most positive impact for you right now? And are there any surprises in there?
In terms of growth, I think the big one was Facebook. Obviously, we saw Facebook sort of hit rock bottom, was it 2021 with ATT or 14.1 going into effect, losing its signals, which then basically made it extremely difficult for them to target the correct people, those that are in market to actually convert. We saw a sort of latency in terms of when those signals disappeared, right? So I think it happened in July. We didn't really see performance impact until about September, October, because they still had signals about users in market. It was only after they basically used those all up that they couldn't replenish, right? So it's like cookie replenishment, right? And so what ended up happening is they sort of hit that bottom, and I think Facebook made a concerted effort over that next year to really figure out how to replace those signals using CAPI, server to server, right? Also using AI. I don't know how many of you guys are using ASC campaigns, but they've been extremely effective for us, right? Savannah shopping campaigns.
Let me stop. Any of you agree with that? That you're seeing, because this was a little
You don't
bit,
need
as a
to.
reporter, this was somewhat news to me to hear that Facebook actually was bouncing back in its performance and that AI was behind it. Are any of you also recognizing that? Yes. Okay.
Thank
All
you.
right. But I mean,
Yeah.
just as a reporter, when I was talking with Keith about this sort of stood out to me as something that was a little bit news to me. That in fact, over the last 5 or 6 months, and it sort of helps explain a little bit of Zuckerberg's new, pivot into AI. Is in fact
Correct.
they already had been making that pivot and been making good use of it.
Correct. And what they actually ended up doing was merging mid-funnel or prospecting campaigns with retargeting campaigns, right? And figuring out what the right distribution between sort of those individuals to actually garner enough interest and ultimately conversion. So it's behind a black box, of course, but the idea is that I have one budget now for Facebook rather than have 2 separate budgets, one for prospecting, one for remarketing. And it allows us then to let the system do its work to actually identify what they already know about their users to convert the ones that they believe, put ads in front of those that they believe will convert.
We're gonna end on AI. We'll get to that in a second. But before we do, I want to move into personalization because we were talking about that broad brand affinity message at the top of the funnel. But as we start moving down, I'm really curious about how you use personalization and especially things like dynamic content optimization as you move down the funnel. How effective is it for your brands, and when and how do you use it?
Right. So DCO is important, and not only for the age-old sort of adage of right person, right time, right message, right? So it's important that you are putting that right message in front, which DCO helps. What I equate DCO to is basically ad copy creative, copying search. Imagine how, basically when you take a display ad, to actually make any adjustment to it is a whole process with the creative team, right? Imagine being able to just rip that apart and say, you know what? We have little boxes here, here, here. I'm going to change my call to action. It's as simple as a quick fix like RSAs or ETAs from back in the day. It allows us to sort of take advantage of that. Now, DCO is broken into two parts. One, which is the creative component that I just talked about, and then the second side of it is AI, which is the predictive side, right? Think of, all right, somebody who visits the site and they look at these pairs of Sauconys, right? But we recognize that if that individual decides to leave, right, it may be better to serve a different product. That is where the predictive side of the equation becomes so powerful, right? And that's where I think DCO is sort of moving in that direction. So a lot of times people think both of those pieces are DCO, which they are, but I like to break them up between one on the creative, one on the AI side of the equation.
Let's pull back. I want to make sure that we talk about the data piece here and the ways in, because you're working across a lot of different brands with a lot of different targets, and yet you're trying to organize this internally in a unified way. And I know that, you know, one of the things that we had talked about is how important data flow is to you within the organization, to make sure that the data is in front of the right people at the right brand at the right time and it's actionable for them, because otherwise you just have a massive data that nobody knows what to do with. Tell us how you guys have reorganized data internally so that all of these many brands that Wolverine has, that they actually can see them, use them, and take action on them in a timely way. Because I know, obviously, timing is sort of the underlying theme for you.
Yep. Yeah. So we went through a RFP last year for a new AOR. We selected Havas, and one of the key tenets for selecting an AOR was around data. It was around reporting, making sure that we were getting the correct data in a real-time manner, and making sure there was aligned vocabulary around that. Perfect example of aligned vocabulary, we assume revenue is revenue. Actually, it's not. Right? When you think about revenue from a transaction basis within Google Analytics, that's different than top-line revenue, which is different than operating margin, which is different than bottom-line revenue. So there are so many different ways that you can cut up revenue as a vocabulary term that it's important that you get that alignment. And so what that also does is if you don't have that alignment, it creates a lot of swirl. And so it was important that we made this part of that RFP process to make sure that we were taking the data, centralizing it in a particular dashboard, and pulling all the data together into that one piece. Now, taxonomy is critical, right? For those of you who are around databases, it is the UID. It's a unique identifier that actually is tied to every single campaign, right? What this allows us to do is connect the dots so we can say campaign A from social is comparable or in an apples-to-apples environment with campaign B, which is in search, right? They're both mid-funnel campaigns when you think about it from a prospecting social to a shopping campaign in search, right? Right now, you would have to pull that data separately and assume that you could connect those dots. Having an automated way of actually putting this all together requires, number one, normalization, and most importantly, that taxonomy, right? And so that you can get the data in real time. And that's the key piece here, is I need to beat every other one of my competitors in terms of what is the right price. The only way you do that is to have the data in front of you. Doesn't mean you always act on it, but if you don't have it, you're already lost, right? So it's important that understanding that information is critical.
What have been the biggest challenges of actually reorganizing this way?
Getting everyone aligned, getting the data. I mean, I think I talked about this yesterday. It is hard to get data. We are a pretty large company, and pulling the data together, basically cleansing that data, making sure the data is correct, making sure all the pipes work, is a full-time job in of itself. And so making sure that you have someone project leading this to ensure that the information is available and the pipes are set up. It's not sexy, but the pipes are critical to this entire process.
So is that a role in the company? I mean, is that one of the learnings here?
Yeah.
Is you really need somebody dedicated to that
Correct.
very job?
Correct.
Okay. Let me ask, so as our exit question, let's talk about the bigger issue of AI and what role it is playing already and you anticipate it playing in solving, filling some of these holes that we've talked about, solving some of the problems and the challenges that you're already seeing. Tell us about where you think AI is going to play a role in the next year or two.
So AI already exists. If you think about AI, there's really two types of AIs. One which is generative, and the other one is predictive. Generative is ChatGPT, it is Bard, right? It is the idea of generating, right? On the other side of that is predictive. Predictive exists, right? We are doing that right now. It's basically sometimes referred to as machine learning, right? What are the products that are currently being used? T-ROAS, right? Within search, CBO for social, right? TCPA for DV360, right? We obviously use a lot of the Google stack. So it's important to understand that it already exists, and making sure that you're playing nice with the AI is going to be a critical part of that. Now, long term, what I want to be able to see is sort of that next level up is how do we ensure that the budgets are being allocated correctly in an ecosystem? So if I have $100 today, I want to make sure I'm spending it to maximize revenue. Right? I can find a campaign that has a ROAS that is marginally better than my sort of average or blended. But if there's a way to create a non-zero sum opportunity where 1 + 1 = 3, that is the holy grail. And the only way you do that is to understand sort of the entire picture of your ecosystem of paid media and how it actually influences organic, how it influences email, and the sort of and SMS and all the other sort of components to it.
But AI, especially in the hands of the platforms, is really handing them ever more control. You're really handing the keys over to them, because essentially they're saying, let our bigger black box that you really can't see within take over here. How do you feel about that, and how do you measure the risk and reward there?
There are no publishers here, right, from Google. All right, I don't like it. To be perfectly honest, I didn't like it probably 4 or 5 years ago when they first introduced T-ROAS. It put too much, basically in the stock market, when you think about market makers and the actual New York Stock Exchange, imagine them both basically trying to figure out how to game the system to basically benefit, even if it's at the cost of the actual traders. This is sort of what ends up happening. So back then, I was concerned about basically letting Google sort of run the ship. And as new entrants came into the marketplace, as more individuals started picking up T-ROAS, we basically hit a critical mass where we don't have a choice anymore, right? AI has basically taken over in this respect, and I can't compete against AI on a manual basis. It's just not possible. And so AI will continue to increase. We have to hope that it benefits us, or more importantly, doesn't hurt us. Our opportunities are going to be to basically say, okay, you have a ROAS target of $4. I want to maximize the amount of revenue that I can generate from that, right? And that's sort of where we're at right now. Who knows what tomorrow's going to look like, but at this point in time, that's where we're at.
Does that ultimately obsolete some of the things you were just described in terms of all of the ways in which you now can optimize and you can watch in real time how things are responding? Because it seems as if more and more of the that the levers you would pull for optimization are really migrating over into this AI black box that you don't see, you can't explain, and you have less and less control over.
Yes and no. I think that what ends up happening is ROAS then becomes a leading indicator rather than a lagging indicator. So as AI actually starts, as we become more and more dependent on AI, what will end up happening is that ROAS, how do I capitalize on that ROAS of $4 or $6 or $8, right? It becomes more leading than it does than how we've operated off of that, being much more lagging.
I don't know why or how or where I'm making more money, but I am.
Right, exactly. I can buy the next phone.
This is how AI is finally going to win. It's going to make us fat and happy.
I'm halfway there.
And I'm happy I don't care about the black box and how it gets us there. Keith Hung, thank you so much. That was great. Do any of you... that was a lot, and like I said, every time I talk to Keith, I'm like I feel like I'm always hanging on and trying to keep up. He has so much experience in this field. Anybody have any questions or thoughts? Yep.
Good morning, Alberto Zeves from Unruly. We're an SSP. You had a really interesting graphic up there, but I was trying to make sure I understand it correctly. Do you find that the more that you put, as far as budget, into the upper funnel, the less you would need to put into the lower funnel, or is it weighted almost like a 50-50?
You don't have to put, one of the things that we did recognize is that you don't put less. You get more at the same ROAS value. So if I actually set a target of $4, right, in this example, as I put more right now, maybe I'm only able to get $12 of revenue. But tomorrow, after I do that sort of upper funnel piece or mid funnel piece, now at $4, I can get $25, right? So there's more inventory available, there's more demand at that particular level, right? And so with more revenue means more spend. Right, so when you talk about a 50-50 split, it's more about the ROAS constraining you rather than necessarily a split of revenue versus cost.
Got it, because when I'm thinking of budgets, I'm thinking of them as a per campaign basis.
Right.
That way, this is what we have for a campaign, how is that split up?
Correct.
Okay.
I'm looking at it from a funnel basis, right? Yeah. And how do I actually maximize the revenue, taking into consideration both short and long term.
Okay, thank you. It was a great conversation, thank you.
Thanks.
Over here. One more. Oh, this is going to be a doozy. I guarantee it. Do it. Do it.
I like how this is my thing now. I'm Jake
Actually,
Sean.
I think you guys talk the same language. When
No,
it comes to
I-
stuff.
you know,
you
we were
are
talking
really
over there in the corner. I'm
you
nodding
throw
my head
off
like-
as many. You throw off as many acronyms as he does.
This is like religion. I feel like
That's
I'm
right.
at church right now, and I love it. Right, this is Media Church. I'm Jake Chun. I'm from Essence MediaCom on the planning side, which I know that you've. I mean, some of the work that I'm doing on my account actually probably has ties to things that you developed there that I'm still working through right now. I'm looking at this diagram here. This is something in essence that I try to perpetuate with every, at a macro level. Is this just a visual visual right now, or have you done testing to see lag time? And so you have a variety of products, even though they're all kind of in the same category. Have you seen significant gaps, or do you find that is relatively consistent with your lag times look like for impact and what your growth opportunity is when you see that lag time and the measurement between like reach and impact, right? It's like you can reach people by running a lot of display ads, or you can reach people by running a video ads. Obviously, there's going to be a different level of impact to your ROAS as a leading indicator diagnostic after the fact.
Oh, okay, that's a lot. Let me unpack that.
It's like you're twins. Honest to God, I think next time I'm just going to have you come up here and interview him.
Sounds good to me.
Go ahead.
So this is illustrative first and foremost, right? It's the idea of upper funnel actually impacting lower funnel and ultimately revenue, right? So, and that there's a latency between when you serve, or rather when you buy the inventory. Is there gaps here? Of course. Some. It really depends upon the purchase cycle, right? So when you're talking about cars, probably a little bit longer than when you're talking about, I don't know, ringtones, right? I always use that as an example, right? Back in the day. So it really does depend upon the actual conversion cycle of the particular product, which is something you have to analyze, right? From a conversion analysis perspective. Additional gaps, you don't know how much the upside is going to look like, because we talked about short-term revenue, right? That's 0 to 12 months. So some of that revenue is going to come in, maybe not during Black Friday, Cyber Monday, but in January of 2023, right? When you think about OLV and CTV, a lot of MMM shows, say hypothetically, $8 ROAS against it. How is that even possible? When you start looking at the MMM data, you actually see that actually rolling through. But the problem is that the first dollar might come in a month and a half from now. The second comes in 3 months. Then 5 of that $8 comes in over the next, from basically month 9 through 12. So it still aggregates over time. It just happens over a much longer time period. Does that help answer?
Yeah, I kind of want the whole testing methodology so I can figure out by campaign that you're working on our category.
Keith was at MediaCom a number of years ago.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
No, because it's also like I've been just using generic benchmarks, right? Because I think unless you test it yourself by category, I should stand right. By category, you just have to use generic benchmarks that you hear. So maybe your MMM tells you see revenue ramp up, begin, and break through at like 2 weeks. So then you start at 2 weeks earlier. But you want to be at peak, which you're guessing maybe 4 to 6 weeks. But you know that video takes time to penetrate. You look at brand lift studies and you try to understand how far in advance you have to be. But if there was a measurement methodology that actually quantified what by category product your window looked like, then we could replicate that same methodologies to understand what's, for my category, what is my lead time, what do I need to maximize my ROAS when the high demand period does come in, like a Black Friday,
Right.
Cyber Monday. How early do I have to start?
Correct. So that's partially test and learn. I think we have that test at MediaCom, the results of it, so talk to Fionn. So she should be able to give you that information.
Do you guys want to take this on the road?
That was amazing.
We got something here.
Keith, thank you so much, man. Always great.
Thanks, everyone.